Hey all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a closer look at the Powkiddy RGB20. This is a retro emulator handheld console that is a competitor in terms of being a vertical style handheld to the popular Anbernic RG280V. And we can get a sneak peek of what it looks like here. So again, compared to the more traditional Switch-like layout, which has the keys on the sides, it positions them below the display to give you maybe something a little easier to put into a pocket, for example. The other model has 512 megabytes of RAM, whereas this one has 1 GB of RAM, which might be sounding low if you're comparing it with smartphone specs, but in the world of handheld retro emulators, it's actually going to be pretty flagship territory. In fact, these represent almost the best hardware specs you can find for a dedicated handheld for playing back older games and titles. It also has a larger display measuring 3.5 inches diagonally. It's a IPS LCD screen, which is fully laminated, so colors are super vibrant compared to the Anbernic, which has a lower resolution. And this one here also has a built-in Wi-Fi chip, which the other models I mentioned are also missing. So the Wi-Fi here allows you to download some things over the air, sending files over and ROMs wirelessly, and there's even some apps that you can use to take advantage of it. It's running on a Linux operating system. There's actually a very basic YouTube player on here as well, so you can connect to the internet and do some basic things like that. The CPU here is using the Rock chip 3326. It's quad-core, clocked at 1.5 gigahertz, and otherwise, again, will play back almost every single retro-style game, whether it's a PSP game, whether it's a Nintendo Gameboy game, GameCube, 64, without really any problems. Finally, it uses a USB Type-C port for charging, and the 3000 mAh capacity battery will last for upwards of 6 hours for gameplay. As far as the packaging is concerned, it is very simple. Inside of the box, we have just the console, Type-C charging cable, as well as a quick start guide. Alright, so the system here is now booting up, and the process is relatively quick. Takes about 15 seconds from a cold state to get into the operating system, and it is very versatile in the sense that if you are into the kind of hacker community, you can also run other versions of Linux on here if you don't like the style that they give you, but overall it's a pretty easy to use interface, and it's quite clean, showing off lots of kind of visual flair. As far as the transition effects are concerned, it's very smooth, going through the different types of consoles games that you can find on the system. Now if we do a quick size comparison before diving in and taking a closer look, here it is next to the Anbernic RG350. This model here was very popular last year as another great kind of retro emulator that can play back many titles and also worked really well, although side by side, the 350 is definitely packing less powerful specs. It has a dual-core 1 GHz processor compared to quad-core 1.5 GHz that we have here, in addition to the display itself, although both of these models do have 3.5-inch screens, as you can see there, so if you put them vertically, they actually have similar dimensions, but the screen back in the day for the 350 was not fully laminated, so there was a gap between the glass and the screen underneath, casting a bit more glare versus this one here, which is almost printed onto the glass. So similar to our smartphone screens, it's very vibrant and definitely has a higher resolution as well. This one back then had a 240 by 320 resolution screen versus 480 by 320 on the new model. So it's still not going to be, say, Ultra HD or Quad HD, anything crazy like that, but definitely more vibrant and sharper if you're going from a model like this over to this one. There's even some Android-powered gaming handhelds, like the A19, that is another popular choice that has weaker specs than this one, believe it or not. It has an slower processor as well as less RAM. Now this one sells for around 80 bucks, so it's not going to be the cheapest model in the world, but still I think for what you're getting, if you do want something that has pretty much the highest end specs for a retro handheld that you can find, it could be worth considering. As far as the build quality is concerned, it does feel decent and relatively solid. The faceplate here, it's actually made out of a brushed aluminum. It's stuck onto the polycarbonate plastic frame, and as a whole it feels pretty solid. The plastic here is similar to what you'll find on, say, a Nintendo 2DS or 3DS, as well as what you'll find on the RG350. So even though it's plastic, it doesn't feel hollow or cheap, has a solid weight to it. Type-C ports here for data transfer and charging, and there's also the Wi-Fi switch that you can turn on or off manually. Comes with a micro SD card that has the operating system and some free included games, a few thousand built in. You can of course always download more ROMs and just load it over onto the SD card and it will play it back. And on the back, it has the most controversial part of this handheld is the shoulder keys. They're actually tucked away inside this little divot, but of course the placement here does mean it's a little bit more squished than if they had maybe put it onto the top instead. instead shifted all the ports onto the bottom portion of the console, but it is what it is. Overall, if you're holding it and you have relatively smaller hands, it still feels, for the most part, comfortable enough to hit, and at least the keys themselves do have a nice tactile sensation to them. It's just maybe the placement here could be slightly higher up, or they can make the gap a little bit larger so that if you have larger hands, it might get a bit more tiresome as you're using these keys. Luckily, not a ton of titles will always require the use of shoulder keys, but it is just one thing to keep in mind. Other than that, it can also stand upright because of the perfectly square form factor that they're using here. Everything is flat, so nothing will really protrude, and it makes it slightly easier to put and store away. Otherwise, what looks like speaker grills on the back are just for decorative purposes because the actual speaker really comes out from the front here, which is a very good placement, and it is just pointing right at you. It does get sufficiently loud as well, sounds decent, although one thing I don't really love about the design here is if we take a closer look, there isn't really a volume control or volume rocker or dial. To change the volume when you're in a game, you have to hit a command, select, and then use the D-pad here up and down to change the volume higher or lower. It's okay, but again, a dedicated volume rocker on the side would be even better, I think. Now, additionally on the side, we do have a reset button as well as a power key. These are pretty flush with the surface, but they prevent any accidental triggers, and as a whole, again, it's pretty well constructed. Zooming into the front faceplate, we do have a four-way navigation toggle, as aforementioned. It feels pretty solid and responsive. There's also the regular A, B, X, and Y buttons, and we also get some additional controls as well, including a R3 and L3, so this is the third kind of shoulder key, and there's also a joystick as a optional method of navigation if you don't want to use the four-way D-pad, and then select and start keys. So overall, the layout does feel pretty good. Really just depends on your preference in terms of the design. The UI here, again, is pretty slick. It gives us a quick look at some of the games which are within each of these different consoles. Famicom, all games, favorites that you can add into a separate bookmark folder, and other ones that, again, we are just scrolling through here to give you a list. Dreamcast, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Sega Genesis, MAME, just going on and on here, Nintendo 64, Nintendo DS, Neo Geo, PC Engine, ports, PSP, PlayStation. Again, everything is going pretty smoothly as far as the overall navigation is concerned, as expected for hardware like this. You really won't find any hints of any slowdowns compared to some of the other consoles. Maybe if you're going super quickly through the menus, it would have an occasional moment of hesitation. By the way, we can also tap on the pause key here to kind of randomly shuffle and go into a different game, just giving us another kind of interesting animation there. We can also tap on the start key here to bring up the main menu for changing things like the different settings, the theme, as well as the font, and the different background images and transition effects can also be customized. And from here, we can also take a look at network settings. It's where you're able to turn on or off the Wi-Fi. This is what the kind of virtual on-screen keyboard is like, as you can enter some information and text into it, and you can see if you're connected or not, and also see if there's any system updates. We can also tap on the start key, by the way, to bring up some quick things like going into a screensaver, relaunch, or reboot the system. We can also tap on Retropie, by the way, which really isn't representing a game per se, but rather the applications that you can run on here as part of the Linux operating system. So from here, we can take a look at things like a file manager, as you can see there. In addition to, there is the aforementioned YouTube mini app that you get here, but it's a very simple interface, and by no means is it as intuitive as the YouTube apps on our phones. But just to give you an idea, it is able to, again, connect to the internet, and then from here, you can search for YouTube videos, entering a search term. Again, a very primitive interface here, but just to give you an idea of some of the kind of apps that you have on here. But if we want to tap on something like, say, Pokemon, I can just tap on Start, change the volume just by tapping on Select and raising it lower, as you can see here, or raising it higher. We can just mute it here for now, but again, that's how you change the volume. We can tap on Start here to begin the game. Again, we do have a pretty large canvas on here in terms of the overall experience. The screen quality is much better than the actual consoles like the Nintendo Game Boy Advance from over a decade ago now. Time really does fly, since it is a fully laminated screen, very nicely backlit, quite bright. Again, very good viewing angles, and also great visibility, even if there's a bit of light hitting on it. In fact, I would say it's one of the most impressive aspects of this particular console is definitely the screen quality. It might be one of the best I've seen so far. In terms of the overall speed, you can see how it's playing along without really any problems, and all the keys and commands are also mapped together without any issues as well. Contrast levels, especially in darker backgrounds, also look quite good for a IPS display, as you can see there. Really looks excellent. You can also opt for the joystick, as we can see here, instead of using the four-way toggle, but everything feels very responsive. no jerky motions at all. Everything is quite smooth, and we can kind of play along here. Everything feels quite good. Now, as far as special commands in terms of saving your game state and whatnot, you can actually access the settings for the emulator software by tapping on the inside two shoulder keys, so R2 and L2. So if I tap on these at the same time, it will bring up this menu here where I'm able to do things like save the game state onto one of the slots, so that whenever I jump back into this game, I can resume from where I left off. And so inside of this particular menu, it actually reminds me a little bit of Sony's PSP. So the interface here is a little bit different, but still is quite easy to navigate. Trying out some other titles here, Nintendo 64, we're going to try out Mario Kart, and once again the loading speeds are quite quick, the controls do feel quite smooth, no screen tearing or anything like that, even on a slightly faster paced game like this. Everything is playing along pretty well. And once again, all the controls in terms of saving state is accessed in the same way as we saw with the other Game Boy Advance game, the Pokemon. So we still use the shoulder keys if at any time I want to save it or bring up some other controls. I also want to mention that inside of the menu system, we can see some stuff like the battery percentage remaining, as well as the time and date. And finally, there's also the ability for you to record the screen of the game as well. So that can be saved as a video file, MP4, for you to then upload or share with other people later on or view back. Here we have Final Fantasy, which is a PSP title loading along, also really without too much issues. And on this particular game, we also have the ability to see the frame rates as it's being played back. So usually around 30 frames per second. PSP titles in general will require slightly more graphics to power compared to, say, Game Boy titles. So it's impressive that everything here is still running around pretty smoothly, everything working as expected. The overall system also doesn't really get hot or anything like that. It remains pretty cool in terms of the temperature, so not too much complaints there. And we're able to still play back the titles for hours on end without noticing any discomfort or thermal throttling or anything like that. So working quite well here. And we just finished this game here. And of course, again, everything is looking quite good. Finally, we can take a look at the port games. These are the titles which aren't really for a retro system, but they were still pretty popular titles that they've shared over, kind of like mobile versions of games. There's 2048. You can even find Doom as it's saved here, and there's also a quick description of the game we'll scroll through on the display, as you can see there. If you give it a few seconds, we can see it just play along here, and again, working pretty well without too much delay or lag. So that's more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Powkiddy RGB20, a vertical handheld retro emulator console that works very well in terms of giving us pretty much the highest end hardware at the moment that you can find on one of these products, with its quad-core chipset and RAM as well as built-in memory really sufficient to run any of these older console games without any delays, any screen tearing or anything like that. Controls on the front here feel very comfortable, display is beautiful and pretty vibrant and great to look at, as well as giving us decent battery life as well. So a pretty neat little handheld overall. You can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.